You enjoying our weather, Lana?
Oh, very much.
There we go. And it's recording, so that's good. That was the problem last week, it didn't record. But actually everyone who was here managed to see it. You know, so that's fine. Schedule call being connected. So there we go, it sounds as if somebody's out there.
Hello.
Ah, hello. How are you doing?
All right, thank you. You okay?
Yes, we're getting battered by some interesting weather up here at the moment.
Yeah. Do you have your power or internet down or anything?
Well, there's been power. The power's been down at certain points. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
West side.
And we've had, well, a gust of over 100 miles an hour a couple of days ago, and well over 80 today. Several blasts. So it's all good stuff. So last week, when you joined us, were you able to attend the whole thing? You weren't sort of kicked out or anything at any point on the system?
No, it worked all the way through basically. So it was fine.
Well, that's splendid. Excellent. So, well, we'll just wait and see if there's anyone else coming from Orkney.
My notes make only sense.
Okay. And remember, if you're not actually speaking on the system, just to switch your microphone off, because the system is very delicate and it automatically goes to wherever it hears the sound. So, here we go. Microphone off. That's good. So that should hold that one. So, I guess I'm not entirely sure if Orkney's open or not. They were slithering about closing Shetland College. But I said I'd be here, so they decided to keep it open. Well, and I don't think our friend from Unst will be joining us. I think it was pretty bad up there, so. But since it's being recorded, I'll just get started. Right, now, as you noticed last week, you didn't actually you were taking notes, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a Dropbox folder, which I'll put the notes this week and last week and the forthcoming weeks in, and I'll take your email addresses, and by using your email, you'll get an email from Dropbox saying that you can have access to that folder and just take stuff and download. It's a Dropbox. It's a website. Uh-huh. Or any computer. It's cloud storage. So if I want to store a paper or a PowerPoint, I can do it on the computer, or I can do it in Dropbox, which is stored on the cloud, and I can access it anywhere. And what you can do with Dropbox is you can share folders with people, which means that you can load quite a lot of stuff on it. You can upload a lot more onto it than you can on an email, for example. So it's a very handy place. And then where are we? Video sources. Okay. Ah, Orkney's joined us.
We are now.
Very good. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Yeah.
We were just wondering there whether Orkney College was perhaps closed, because they've been thinking about closing Shetland College tonight because the weather has been quite windy. But it's good to see you, so that's fine. So I think Susan might not be joining us, our potential PhD student, and as I say, Unst probably not joining us, but otherwise I think we'll get going. I was just saying, Orkney folk, that I'm going to open a Dropbox folder and put the material in that so that you can access it. So I'll just take your emails and I'll send a link to you, and you can access the stuff and download it. I think it's the easiest way of doing it. Okay. So, are there any questions from last week before we get launched into having a look at stuff.
I'm okay.
Okay.
What did you discuss last week, Andrew, since I wasn't here?
We discussed the origins of the Viking raids, what it was all about, and we discussed slavery, and we discussed boat burials. So we looked at boat burials in the Northern Isles and compared and contrasted them with boat burials further afield. So all the stuff, again, there's a big PowerPoint with lots of information there. So we're going to move on from raids to settlements. We mentioned settlements very briefly last week, but I want to have a good look and good discussion about settlements today, and look at houses, particularly houses in the Northern Isles and houses in other parts of Scandinavia, and have a look at what comprised, what made up a Viking house. What was a typical Viking house? And then if we've got time, I'll do something else with you. But if we don't have time, I'll do it next week. So I'll keep that light under a bushel. Okay. So just tell me, in Orkney, can you see the PowerPoint?
No, with no signal on that screen. It's just flickering on saying no signal.
No signal. Okay. Still flickering?
No, nothing going at the moment.
Okay.
It's probably something to do with the Wi-Fi here. I've been having bother all day with it. So.
Right. Is there a telephone there in your...
Yeah.
Ring 155 and just switch off your microphone just now. Ring 155 and tell them that you're having a problem and see if they can fix it. Otherwise, it might just be due to the weather and we'll just have to cope with it. And you can see the PowerPoints in the Dropbox. Okay, so why houses and settlements? You're going to have difficulty seeing my face, Arnold, but I'm sure that's not a problem for you.
Do I look at your face or do I look at the screen?
Well, I think the screen has frozen, so probably
I see. Okay.
my face is still a little bit animated, so I think it should be all right. Okay.
I've not got the PowerPoint. Am I supposed to be able to see it?
You should be able to see the PowerPoint, yeah.
Yeah, I can just see the classroom.
Okay. Right. Well, you're just going to have to cope, I'm afraid. Let's have a look. Try that one. Okay. It's frozen. Okay. Right. Well, we just have to cope. As I say, you can see the PowerPoints online. There's a thought. Could I do that just now? No, not in time. Okay, we'll just have to listen to my exciting discussion of what's on screen, and hopefully that will draw a picture there for you. Okay, now, in the Northern Isles, we may not have an Oseberg or a Gokstad ship, as we discussed last week. We have some good boat burials, but nothing of that standard. Nor do we have a Jorvik or a Woodstown, which is a most recently discovered Viking Age town in Ireland that no one knew anything about. Which is odd because we know quite a lot about Viking Age Ireland because of the annals that I mentioned last week. But this particular Viking town seems to have prospered in the late 9th, early 10th century and then disappeared. So it preserves a huge amount of stuff. It was a very important trading centre. So I just put that up just to show you that there are still things out there to be discovered, and you never know what might turn up next. And Woodstown, they just published, as you can see from the screen, the book of the findings. And it's an extraordinary amount of stuff that they found at Woodstown. It was a defended town, had lots of silver, weapons, all sorts of extraordinary stuff, and then lost to history. Then rediscovered when they were building a bypass on one of the Irish roads at the height of the Irish boom. So we don't have anything like that, which is a bit disappointing. However, in the Northern Isles, we can be proud of the number of Viking and late Norse farming settlements and buildings that we have. We have a lot of them. And these are, in many ways, as interesting, well, I try and tell myself that, I suppose, as interesting as places like Woodstown and Jorvik, because they tell us about the Viking way of life and how it was practiced in the Northern Isles. That's just, can't affect the lighting in here, a map of Unst with the longhouses that have been identified so far. The red ones are definite, the blue ones are probable, and the yellow ones are uncertain. But you can find this in the proceedings, the new book on Viking Unst. And of course, where Unst is concerned, the number of longhouses goes up and down, probably around 50 Viking Age longhouses now. There are more longhouses than that, but some of them are later in date. And compared to other areas of the Viking world, that is an extraordinary concentration of Viking and late Norse houses. So we should be proud of that. And as we'll see, there are good examples in Orkney as well, so we'll come to them in due course. So houses are, they tell us a lot about the culture of the people. Houses are invested with huge cultural significance. And because of that, you find in the archaeological record that they can remain unchanged for an enormous period of time. And I'm going to mention longhouses very soon. And longhouses, the longhouse with a byre, which we're about to look at, goes back 3,000 years or so. So they have they're invested with cultural significance, and they're important to people, and they're invested with meaning. Therefore, they tend not to change so quickly. They're places where rituals of everyday life are carried out. And the way that they're organised and set up has immense meaning and symbolic meaning to the people who live in them. And in fact, the study of houses has been a source of much anthropological research. And the great anthropologist Levi Strauss, who wrote a book called The Raw and the Cooked, amongst others, wrote extensively about the significance of houses within cultures. Houses have been studied as an example of a society's material culture and symbolic meanings, as I mentioned, also as a locus of the domestic domain, and also how societies produce a living. For example, a farmhouse, how it was run, how it produces enough for the society. And various studies that look at houses have revealed ways in which the actual aspects of the architecture of a house are used to symbolise social relationships within a house and the categories of how different categories of people are placed within a building. And other studies have shown that gender differences can be represented within a house as well. One gender tends to dominate one part of the house, the other generates the other. So, you could imagine, if you're thinking of The Simpsons, Madge dominates the kitchen, and Homer dominates the settee in front of the telly. So, you have different ways of dividing up a house. And that's why I didn't stick up the Simpsons. I stuck up this picture of a Sami kotta. The Sami who live in the north of Scandinavia. I'm trying to shout out above this noisy hail that's attacking us again. They had a very rigid and structured way of dividing up their house. And that you might not think, well, that's not much of a house. But it is. It's a house as much as anything else. And there were symbolic spaces within this kotta. That's how it's usually pronounced, but you can also guachta. And they would have the fire in the middle, or middle, but toward, sort of more, not quite in the middle, towards the door, but within the centre of the house. And the space was divided up amongst who could sit where. And beyond the fire, sort of at the distance from the front door, there was a sacred area which was strictly forbidden to women, and that's where the 9 kept their hunting gear, which women were not allowed to touch. And the sitting around the fire was defined by generation. And we're talking right up until the 20th century now. We're not talking sort of in the Middle Ages or the early Middle Ages here. Parents would sit on one side of the fire, older children would sit on the opposite side, younger children would sit with their parents, guests and servants slept by the entrance on the children's side of the fire. So it's very, very rigid and regimented. Okay. And that's not unusual. That's not that's typical of traditional societies, that you have your house split up into different ways. So it's probable that rules and traditions about how one lived in a Pictish house before the Vikings got to the Northern Isles also was invested with meaning. As you know, the space within the Pictish house, there would be a certain place where the wife would dominate, and another place where the husband would, and perhaps where the grandparents would sit. We don't know exactly, but we can assume that that is the case. And it's possible that the social and cultural use of a Pictish house was different from that of a Viking house. And the main reason for thinking that is the shapes are so very different. So a Viking 3-aisled longhouse, which we will come on to soon, was a sort of very different shape from a typical Pictish house, so one can assume that the space inside was different, so it was likely to be used differently by the two societies. So when you get the Norse establishing their settlements and building their houses on top of the Pictish houses, then it's not just architecture that we're talking about. We're talking about symbolism, we're talking about culture, we're talking about all sorts of things that are invested in a house, changing when the Norse arrive. A little bit of study has been done on what the possible symbolic use or ideas behind a Norse longhouse might have been. And Dockstatter, strange name, but anyway, argued that the Norse longhouse was structured by a cosmic cognitive view of the world, where hierarchical and gender structures were reflected in the vernacular architecture. In other words, where the house was positioned and how it was divided up inside reflected the cosmos outside and the genders within the family group. And in the model that they came up with, which was derived from the evidence of saga literature, north and south represented the supernatural and the mortal, where the east and west represented a distinction between men and women. So, if you like, if you think of your house, you've got supernatural bits and you've got male and female bits within your house. And it's been noticed that a lot of Norse longhouses are in fact set out east-west, as if they're set within a cosmological view of where a house should be positioned. It's not just random, I would say. You can actually read that article. I've got a link to it, so when I put the notes up, you can have a look. So, when you take a typical Pictish house, which we're about to look at, and a typical Viking house, I think we can also say that the symbolism and the culture are different in both cases. However, there's a little rider to that. There's some evidence which has been found recently which suggests that the pre-Viking inhabitants of the Northern and Western Isles were starting to move towards rectilinear houses, which are the typical Norse house, before the Vikings arrived. So there might have been some new cultural ideas coming in to the Isles before the Vikings. So it's like all these things. You think you've got a very clear distinction, but then things muddy the picture a little bit. But if you take the the very typical, then you get a clear distinction. Just check. How's everyone doing in other parts?
All right, yeah. Still no PowerPoint, but yeah, can hear it all.
You can hear it all, that's fine.
Yeah.
So, sorry about the PowerPoint, but you'll get it later on. And this is recorded as well. It's supposed to be recorded, so you can watch it again if you wish, and compare what I'm saying with the PowerPoint. It's one of these things that just happens with technology. You can't trust it.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
You can hear me. Well, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, right. Just one last thing to say about the symbolic nature of houses, which has some relevance to the Norse. It is that people are wedded to their house. Sounds a strange thing to say, but they like the house type that they've grown up with. They don't really like to adopt other things. Maybe individuals do, people with a bit of imagination, but your general member of society likes to have a house that looks like a house to them. And this has been shown by looking at people who go and move abroad. So when the British went to take over territories, they took their houses and house styles with them. They didn't adopt the Iroquois longhouse, or they didn't adopt African-style houses. They kept their houses that they knew how to live in and meant something to them. And that's what the Norse did when they started to move west. They took houses, the idea of the house, with them. And it might not have been the best type of house for the environmental experience that they had. There's a lot of wood in the Norse house. So when they were building long houses in Iceland, where there's not much wood, just like in Orkney and Shetland, people had to go from Iceland back to Norway to get the wood to take back to do the insides of their houses, which wasn't terribly efficient. And it took a long time for new developments to take place, for the houses to become properly embedded in their environment. And in fact, the Norse houses, the typical Norse houses, were probably not as well adapted to the Northern Isles environment as the Pictish houses had been. But as soon as the opportunity arose, the Norse built their own type of house on top. Okay, so it's worth bearing in mind. A cultural change is not necessarily because it's better. A cultural change can be because people bring in preconceived ideas about the way things should be. Now, what I've got here on this picture is a picture of Bronze Age building styles. Now, that's a long time in the past. But interestingly enough, traditional house styles from the late Bronze Age can be traced right up, in many cases, into the early medieval period. So like 2,000 years later, there's a direct continuity to get these traditions. And the Nordic tradition of longhouse is there in northern Germany, Denmark, and Scandinavia. And there's another tradition of house building which includes the British Isles, Brittany, and the north of Spain, and should include eventually Orkney and Shetland. But perhaps in the Bronze Age there was a slight difference there. There was a kind of, as far as I'm aware, a sort of native house building tradition that hadn't quite been adopted the Atlantic tradition yet, but it did eventually, and that's why you get brochs, which, if we don't follow Brian Smith's interpretation of them, are the most extreme version of an Atlantic roundhouse, which is part of this Atlantic tradition. So ultimately, Orkney and Shetland are part of this tradition, the Atlantic tradition, long before they become part of the Norse or Nordic tradition. So a typical Pictish house, well, there isn't really such a thing as a typical Pictish house. There's a great variety of different styles. But one thing that a lot of them have in common is that they're cellular. So if you go back quite a bit before the Viking Age, to between, say, 2nd or 3rd century AD, you get round houses, which are very much Atlantic style. But then between that period and the Norse, you get a variety of different things. You get people continuing to live in the round house, which is the Scatness one down to the right, and people living in slightly different, sort of oddly shaped things like this one at Gurness in Orkney. But what they have in common is they're using stone to divide up little bits within the building for getting on, doing whatever they happen to be doing in these bits, little alcoves. So they have cellular is the best description for that. And there are also things called jelly bean houses, which are, again, they tend to be set more in a line, but they're still sort of cells, if you like, stuck together. What they would have looked like on the outside, of course, is, some of them would just look like a roundhouse. Others would have looked quite odd. I'm not quite sure what the Gurness house would have looked like with a roof on it, but sort of lumpy, I think, is perhaps the technical term for it. Whereas a typical, before we get into any details here, a typical Viking three-aisled longhouse, in comparison, is a very different looking structure. And 3 different examples here. Kvivik, which we'll come to later on. Longhouse, where is that one from again? Let's see. Oh, okay, that's from Iceland. We'll actually come to that one as well. And another one from Iceland as well. So longhouses. And they would have looked very different. It's a different statement, invested with different meanings.
What do you think drove the shape of the longhouse? This rectilinear width. Was there anything particular that drove that shape? Or?
Well, it's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but I know it's very, very old. Goes back into the Neolithic. They tended to build in rectilinear styles. And in fact, at Balbirnie, on the mainland of Scotland, they found what they thought. They took an aerial photograph and they thought it was a Dark Age hall, a long hall. Turned out to be a Neolithic house. So from about 4000 BC.
And that was where?
Balbirnie.
In
Fife, or near Fife, yeah. Need to check the exact details.
That is a thing that they talk about Viking halls. Right? There's one period in Scalaway, there was Scalabaga. One of the potential names was, there was once a huge Viking hall at Scalaway. But here we're talking about long houses, living houses, as opposed to halls, ceremonial halls. So with the ceremonial halls, just basically the same sort of same shape, but much, much larger. Is that how you differentiate between the halls and the houses?
It's a very good question, and we're going to come on to halls just in a wee while, but I'll introduce the subject. It's difficult to say. There are enormous structures in Scandinavia, which are more than one would expect just to they're more than a farm. They must have had ceremonial power, the power bases, places where you could feast a retinue of soldiers, statements in the landscape that somebody really powerful lived there, a central place where people would come to when they wanted to indulge in trade or they wanted to get the help of the powerful person that lived there. But the hall itself, there seems to be no clear definition in the Scandinavian literature that I've been able to find that would make a distinction between a longhouse and a hall. They're both built in the same way. Some of these structures, particularly the huge ones, are used for ceremonial, but also for living in. But others, the smaller ones, built in essentially the same way, are farms. But then it gets more complicated when you go to sort of places that, like the Atlantic Islands. As far as I'm aware, so far, no huge hall has yet been found. But farms that perhaps performed that function are likely to have existed. So the farm of somebody important that people would come to carry out ceremonial events or whatever. But that they would be indistinguishable really from farms, other than the fact that somebody important lived in them. In Norway, from around the 4th century, you start to see sometimes they often had 2 houses, and then from around the 4th century start building a 3rd house, and it seems to not be divided up, just it's a bigger space inside, but on the outside looks the same. And the suggestion is that in certain farming communities, farm buildings were set up as halls, but they weren't particularly grandiose buildings. But there were structures, particularly in Scandinavia, in certain places, which I've got some pictures of, where we're talking about something of a completely different scale altogether. And the Skåli place name, we'll come to that in a wee while as well. But it's a really good question. Sometimes things are lost in translation between Scandinavian languages and English, and the sort of loose use of a term which then gets interpreted. Even Skåli itself can be used, or has been used by some people, just as to mean a longhouse. So it's sort of confusing. So when you're reading the material, you have to make your own opinion. And in my opinion, so far, no actual halls have been discovered in the Northern Isles. But buildings, bigger farms that may have fulfilled that function at certain times, I'm sure they are amongst the corpus of buildings that we've already discovered.
It's the word boa and bow come into farm.
Oh, bow.
There's a place in Trondheim that used to be called the Earl's Bow.
Yes.
And bow.
Yeah. Yes. There's.
That's just the area ground, or is that the type of building that might have been on that?
Well, it tends to it means Boo in that sense means a farm, a place you live, but it tends to be a farm. But the Earl's Boo is interesting because you get that same type of construction in Orkney as well, and the assumption is that those are farms that were owned by the Jarl. So they were farms, they did their duty producing the crops for the Earl. Yeah. And because at the time we're talking about, Jarls could only maintain their power by peripatetically moving around, just as kings did. So they had to be places that they could visit and ensure that they would have something to eat, and more importantly, drink when they got there, and somewhere they could put on a feast, presumably to entertain the leading people in that particular area, to maintain that power structure. So there'll probably be somebody in an Earl's Boo. Yeah. So we're looking after it, waiting for living off it and waiting for the opportunity.
Big moment.
Yeah, a big moment when the Jarl appeared. But that's that. We're moving into the sort of the late Norse period in that context, when we actually have organisational structures established in the Northern Isles, and the ability of people to maintain power and exercise power within it. Administration, basically, yeah. But it does. It represents a specific type of important farm. Whether it actually represents a different type of architecture, though, that's a moot point until it's actually excavated. So, right, well, we've talked quite a lot about various things. Talked about the house as being invested with meaning and being a cultural icon, and the fact that the Norse had a 3-aisled longhouse, which they brought with them when they came to settle in the Northern Isles. But where did that come from? Where was the origins of the 3-aisled longhouse? And what is a 3-aisled longhouse? What does it mean? Well, the longhouses that the Vikings established in the Northern Isles have a long period of existence in Scandinavia itself before the Viking Age. Now, a lot of what I'm saying is I'll probably be generalising quite a bit, but the reason is that you find different details in different archaeological papers and in different studies that you read. And it's probable that there were varieties and variations within Scandinavia over time. But that being said, it's clear that the longhouse as a concept and as a structure didn't change all that much. There may have been slight variations in them. Some had cattle in a byre attached to the end. Others didn't have and had a byre outside. And some people have tried to work out a chronology of how these things, but it keeps breaking up. Presumably, there was a bit of variety in how these things were built. But the basic concept of a longhouse goes back deep into the past. And the example of the picture here is from Ulandhaug in Stavanger. And this dates something along the lines of between 400 and 600 AD. So between 400 and 200 years before the Viking Age started. But effectively, you've got the same kind of houses, as you can see. For those who can't see, they're longhouses with living accommodation at one end and a byre at the other. So, I guess it's not surprising. I mean, we're living in houses, many of us, that are getting on for 200 years old, but these could be 400 years old before the Vikings age started. You can actually visit these in Stavanger. They've been reconstructed. So next time you're there, go and have a look. There were 4 houses, 3 have been reconstructed. And it's assumed that they were thatched and with straw and then turf on top, that the exterior walls were insulated. The interior walls were insulated by exterior walls, and the half of the floor was given up to a byre, and half was living space. There was an outhouse as well. Within the bit that was lived in, there was a kitchen, a sleeping room, and a living room. So it seems to have been quite sort of busy place. And what makes these very similar to some of the later longhouses in the Northern Isles is that the roof is actually supported by 2 rows of posts rather than the wall. The wall is there to provide insulation and to stop the wind howling in. But the roof is actually built on posts. There are posts within the structure, and the roof is on that, and the wall doesn't have anything to do with the...
So that'd be horizontal posts, or was it low, what I call ceilings, and then the triangular shaped beams going up there, peaked or what?
There you go.
Yeah.
Just like that.
Something
Yeah.
like that, yeah.
That's how they built in the Viking house in Unst, the long house.
Yeah.
With the post. We sneaked in one day because there was nobody there.
Oh, I've not seen that.
Mm-hmm. No, we've got to have a look at that.
They're rebuilding a Viking house, are they?
They are, yes. Yeah.
They have the outline of
On
it.
the inside.
They've got the outline and the inside as well.
Whereabouts is that?
Haroldswick.
Skip Ladner.
Oh, yes. Right.
So the Skip Ladner is going to be part of the kind of... Yeah. So they pulled that up on the shore, and then they've got their house, and then they'll have folk doing Viking-y things.
There wasn't a Viking house there previously, was there?
No.
No. It's just
They chose one of the only spaces in Unst that didn't have a Viking house on it to stick their new one, so that no one would be confused. But so for those in Orkney and further away, there is a reconstructed longhouse being built in Unst. Well, it's more or less finished now. They're just waiting for to sign off various fire regulations and building warrants and all that kind of stuff. But it's well worth a visit. So when you all come up to Shetland, I would heartily recommend a day in Viking Unst, which we'll come on to just in a short minute. So the rafters then, if you like, are not supported by the wall. The wall is not structural. It's there just to protect it. But what you've got, in fact, is a wooden frame.
inside.
And that's what creates the three-aisled longhouse. You can't really see it on this particular picture, but if you imagine that you've got your your posts, and then perhaps you might even have stave wood, between the posts, making a room, and then you can walk down either side between the wood and the wall. There you've got your three-aisled longhouse, you see.
Yes.
So that's how it was done. And the other name for this particular type of wooden construction, the bit that's inside the longhouse, is there's an English term which I can't remember, but I saw it today. But in Norway, it's grind bygget, so built like a gate. Really, is how it's. And that style of building the wooden structure carried on in Rogaland, the area around Stavanger, right up until the present day. So it was it's had a long period of existence from the Viking Age, and a long period before the Viking Age as well. Okay, that's Borg. Now, generally in Norway, longhouses had part of the longhouse given over to cattle. And this is called a fjøs in Norway, which comes from Old Norse fehus, which means cow house, cattle house. And this, the bringing in, the living of the cattle and the people in the same building, seems to have happened in the Younger Bronze Age. So it goes way back, maybe 1500 BC. Before that, they didn't share. They still had longhouses, but they didn't share. And around 1500 BC in Norway, the Kai are brought in to the building. And this seems to be an innovation that came in from North Germany, where it had carried on for another 1,000 years before that. So it was a long time. And of course, people have argued about why did this happen. And there are different types of argument. There are utilitarians. Oh, it makes the place hotter, and it's easier to muck out the byre if you're living there. You don't have to go if the cattle are out on the hill. It's much more difficult to gather the manure for spreading on the ground. Makes sense. But others have argued that it's possible, but it doesn't actually warm the house up that much, apparently. People have done studies of these things. And another argument is that in the late Bronze Age, cattle became invested with great symbolic meaning. It was at that point that cattle became equivalent to wealth. In a lot of in Indo-European, actually, in Indo-European languages, sometimes the word for cattle is the same as the word for wealth. Yep. It is. Or worth. So, fee, I think the old Indo-European word was fehu or something for cattle. And that gives the English word fee. So.
In the runes as well.
Fehu, yes, that's right. It is, that's the rune, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. So, the possibility is that cattle became, although I don't know why they weren't associated with wealth before that. That's sort of one of these, that's a problem for this particular argument. But nonetheless, if cattle suddenly become the way that you express your wealth, the more cattle you have, the more powerful you are, the wealthier you are, you want to look after your cattle. And you don't want them roaming about where folk can steal them. You want to keep them close at hand in your house, even if it's not all that pleasant living in a house with cattle. But despite the fact, once it was established as a tradition, then it continues from the Bronze Age right up until the Viking Age. You have this cattle in the house. And of course, it continues a lot longer than that in certain places. So, some black houses, you still have your cattle in one end and your people in the other. And the picture here that I've got on the screen at the moment is the longhouse at Borg, which is the longest longhouse ever found. And it's also a hall. So this is one of these complicated things.
What date is this?
Borg. Well, it dates from there's a. It seems to have been continually sort of lived on from around 600 until the Viking Age, until I think about 900 or thereabouts.
Where's Borg in Norway?
It's in Norway, yeah, and it's you can see the mountains behind. It's on the Lofoten Islands.
Very far north.
Very far north, a very important site, and it seems to have been divided up, this building, into different functions, and one side of it was used for cattle, so they did have their byre within the same structure, as it were. But they also had a room in the middle which was large, and since the whole building is large, a single room within it was also quite large. And the idea is that this room in the middle was used as a hall. So this figure, whoever was the lord of Borg, would do their ritual and festive events within the hall within the building at Borg. I should say that, there you go. There's a picture of the excavation site, it's the plan. And that's how they believe it was divided up. So,
again, the 3 aisles.
The 3 aisles, yes. It's just a massive 3-aisled longhouse. Yeah. I mean, it's over 80 metres long. Yeah. And in fact, there was a person called Ottar, or Ochtare, who visited King Alfred in the late 9th century, who said that he came from very far north of Norway, and that he made his money by taxing the Sami people who used to bring him furs, and that he had gone for a trip around the whole north of Norway into the White Sea. And this chap, Ottar is the Old Norse version of his name. Ochtare is how it turns out is written in King Alfred's text. Came to visit Alfred, and he was a fabulously wealthy man. And it's been suggested, not without some plausibility, that Ottar was the man, the chief, who lived in Borg at the height of his power.
So what were these people known as then? If you're talking about them in the pre-Viking age in Norway, we talk about the Picts and things here. What did they call them in Norway?
Well, they usually just call them by their sort of their era, their period, you know. So they're the Merovingian period folk, or the Germanic Iron Age, or the people of Norway in the Germanic Iron Age. There's no suggestion that they were different people. They are the same people. That's what makes it different from the Northern Isles. Or in fact, different from Scotland, because if you look at the early medieval history of Scotland, you get a variety of different folks coming in, so distinctive that they have different languages and different cultures. But in Norway, that's not the case. You just have the ancestors of the people who later become the Vikings. But sometimes you get references to the fact that these people, they may have been culturally pretty much indistinguishable one from another, but they lived in different kingdoms. So pre-Viking Norway seems to have been divided up into a lot of small kingdoms. And Rogaland, for example, is the land of the Rugi, a tribe. Hordaland is the land of the Horðar. And sometimes these Rugi and Horðar, they're remembered into the Viking Age, and sometimes you get references in Icelandic sagas. So their distinctiveness was recognised. Not their cultural distinctiveness, but their political distinctiveness, if you like. Because there was no way in the pre-Viking era of uniting Norway as one political unit. And of course, yeah.
That's why we ended up with a story that they came here as settlers because of all the fighting between the different kingdoms in Norway and land disputes. That's where all that story came from.
Well, it might have something to do with it. I don't think, as a belaboured the point last week about the raids. I don't think it was perhaps the reason for the raids, but it might have been part of the reason for the settlements, because if you could get yourself out of the internecine domestic violence of Norway and move yourself, your cattle and your slaves or whatever over to Shetland, you could maybe build yourself a better place to live, until violence inevitably broke out here too. But I mean, it might have been a motivating force. Usually in settlement, there are push and pull forces. It has to be worth the effort in making the trip. So it's possible that was part of the mix. And certainly that was the legend that was promoted in Iceland when the Icelandic historians in the 11th century were starting to collect the stories of the land now and of why Iceland had been settled. The big story that was sort of developed was the career of Harald Hårfagri, Harald Fairhair, and his violent attempt to create the Kingdom of Norway on the basis of these small kingdoms. But that's a different story and a very complicated one, because it's really difficult to date Harald Hårfagri. There was a traditional date that these medieval scholars came up with, but then there are problems with that, and there's also a problem with whether he actually existed or not. There's another problem, and because without going into it, the only Harald Hårfagri who's mentioned in a contemporary poem or in a contemporary source rather, is Harald Hardrada. He's actually known as Harald Hårfagri in a contemporary English source. So it could be that this myth of Harald Hårfagri is a projection into the past. Stories about Harald Hardrada. Yeah. So there's all these sort of complicated things.
Somewhere in the slaves was a big driver.
It was a big driver, yes. Yes. But then again, obviously, other people wanted land as well to settle. And that's not necessarily because there wasn't any land in Norway, but perhaps it was easier for them, for their particular position in society, to acquire land. Yeah, but these little kingdoms are quite interesting, and they often end with land as their sort of generic term. Okay, right, let's have a wee look at the Northern Isles stuff then. First of all, we'll just have a look at the pre-Unst material, then look at the Unst material, and then look at the Orkney material as well. So I can't go into great depth, of course, we don't have a lot of time, but it's just to give a flavour for the scale of these things. We have so many of them, you know, it's really a fertile field, shall we say. Okay, so we have Jarlshof then. Can't ignore Jarlshof. We have to begin with Jarlshof because it's the best known site, and for a long time it was the most completely excavated, and it was the only one that we had a complete publication of the excavation as well, which came out in 1956 by J.R.C. Hamilton. So it was the definitive. This is the longhouse against which all other Northern Isles longhouses are compared. So I've just what you can see from this picture is an excellent example of the two different building styles. You know, you've got a tradition on the seaward side. Ignore the later building of the Atlantic building tradition, going back, well, perhaps roughly 1,000 years before the Viking houses, and then you've got Bronze Age stuff even earlier than that. But you can contrast the pre-Viking stuff with the Norse houses. I mean, you can't get a better symbolic explanation of a different way of living in a house and thinking about houses than by contrasting these two. I've taken the notes for this particular one from Anna Ritchie. So there are different interpretations of the material, but she is certainly an expert on Viking houses, having excavated Buckway in Orkney, and her interpretation, based on Hamilton's, is that the first Norse building is likely to have been established during the 9th century. Difficult to say exactly when in the 9th century. But there's a gilt bronze harness mount made in Ireland in the 8th or 9th century, which was found in the earliest building levels. So that sort of helps to date it. And the farmhouse, which you can see shining sort of white in the middle there, was a simple, long, rectangular house with one long wall slightly bowed.
Which one is that?
This one here.
Oh, this one.
That's
Yes,
right.
yes,
One
yes.
right in the middle there.
I'm getting
Yeah.
confused with the medieval building.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, okay.
That's,
We're going with the long houses on it.
Yes.
So that was the
First one. Yeah.
first one.
The first one, yeah. In fact, what I've got a rough. I'm sorry for those who can't see this out of Shetland, but I've got a collection of the different eras of the longhouses, put one on top of the other to give you a sort of feel for what actually happened. So there's the very first one. So the very first house was from the 9th century, divided by a wooden partition on the line of 2 doors. So it's got 2 doors there. So depending on which way the wind's blowing, you can open one door and look out, or open on the other. There's a small kitchen, which is on one end, the sort of, what would you say, the northwestern end of the building. And there's the long bit, you could call it a hall, whatever you want to call it, the main part of the farm building on the other side of the 2 doors, with a central hearth and a raised platform, which would have been a wooden platform along each wall. And these platforms were used for seating, sleeping, and as a working space. And you find lots of references to them in the Icelandic sagas. And the roof was centrally supported on posts, so it was a 3-aisled longhouse.
Yeah, but the difference is it's got stone walls.
It has got stone walls, yes. But it's unlikely that the roof was actually supported by the walls again.
The stone walls were in addition to the traditional timber 3-aisled
Yes.
longhouse you showed us in Norway. So is that
Oh yeah.
peculiar to Shetland?
No, I should have shown you that. I'll go back to the Uland.
Sorry to throw you back.
No, it's fine. There's, you see, example of the board one there. The walls should be there should be walls on the outside there. You're better on the picture there. See?
Is the one nearest us, is there no a beam supported by the wall, that one?
Perhaps there is, but there shouldn't be. As you can see,
So
the
that's stone
reconstruction.
walls?
Yeah, it's stone and turf walls.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the basic.
It looks like a double wall, in fact.
It looks like that, yeah. Mm-hmm. I haven't actually been there, so I can't tell.
No.
But yeah, it would seem that the first house didn't. They had the walls, yes, but they also had the wooden structure inside. So. Yeah, timber framed with a covering of turf. In fact, perhaps it was on the roof as well. There was a couple of other buildings associated with it. A barn or byre. So the byre's separate in this one. It's not part of the building. That's why I say there's variety. And there's this chronology that was built up to say that those houses that had byres attached to as part of the same building were older than those that didn't. But that doesn't seem to be entirely the case. There seems to be a bit of variety in the picture. And there was also a building which has been interpreted as a smithy and also a bathhouse. But the bathhouse, people think it might be a sauna or something like that, but it could also have been used for drying grain. It was just a smaller structure. And over time, the buildings developed. So you start to get another building built there. That's definitely some sort of byre on the outside, number 2. As time goes on, the farm expands. And then they build a byre on the end of the original longhouse. So it becomes, if you like, a typical longhouses, we are led to believe these things existed. But in actual fact, in this case, the buyers added later to the house.
So that's not the kitchen then. We've always been talking about that building there as the kitchen, because it's higher up.
Not this bit here.
That's the buyer.
That's the buyer there.
Oh yeah, no, the back there.
Kitchen's up there. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, you're right. That's it's up in this bit.
And the sitting room below, it's still
Yes. And it's changed because they don't have the Laneld, the long fire there anymore. That's been removed. So it's perhaps in the 11th century that this particular version of the house is established. So it's 150 years old or so by the time this particular development takes place. And by this time, of course, it's a really substantial farming settlement. And considering its site, its position, it's possible that it was also a small market site. This was a place that people would head for. This is the big. This might have been a hall, or at least a hall might have, shall we say, it might have functioned as a hall in the
early stages. Yeah.
In the early stages, it looks like that. But even in the later stages, I mean,
There's not another one like it, is there?
There's nothing quite like Jarlshof as a whole.
As a whole.
No, not yet. No. It's quite a unique place. In fact, Shetland doesn't make enough of it, I think. I'm sorry, Orkney, but you make an awful lot of Scarabray. Jarlshof is a lot, well, shall we say, as good as Scarabray, but hardly ever gets, that doesn't get as many folk visiting it. And that's a very final version of the...
What's that abutment that's on the...
Extra stuff, yeah.
Just another outhouse.
An outhouse is attached, yeah. So yeah, Jarlshof is the first and probably the best example, but it doesn't necessarily have the best dating evidence for us. But it's certainly an outstanding example. And before the Unst project, the only other real longhouse that we had was the Lower Underhull in Unst. It is in Unst as well, of course, but this was again well excavated, but in the 60s by Alan Small, who was a geographer amongst other things, and an expert on Viking settlement in Scotland. And the Underhull house, well, it's not as grand as the Jarlshof example, as you can see. And Small dated this one to the first half of the 9th century, so this might be a really rather early example of a longhouse. And if you want to read up in proper detail and see if I've got my facts right, then the Royal Commission of Ancient Historical Monuments has, well, actually, this is the Journal of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, PSAS. That's available online, so you can read all the archaeological reports. You may know this already, but if you don't, there's a huge amount of material that's available online. So you can read up about what Alan Small had to say about the excavation.
Just when you get such conflicting advice, and then people get very possessive about their interpretation of what it means.
Well, it's a moving target.
Yeah. Well,
It's very
probably
controversial.
we're all probably completely wrong, but we're all making an effort. Yeah, but I think this is the general thing. I mean, the specifics. Each house will be a house of its own. The person who had that house, who built that house, will have had their own needs, their own desires, their own want to show off to their neighbours or wanting to keep everything hidden, just like houses are today. But there's a kind of general, generic house, and it can come in slightly different forms. But when you see one, you know that you're seeing people who belonged to a culture who built longhouses that went back for a couple of thousand years in Norway.
And is it true that Unst has the largest concentration of Viking longhouses?
So far?
North of Scotland.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's no other areas of Shetland being checked, is
Not yet, no.
There could
But
be other places.
there could be. There could well be. The thing about Unst is it was...
Was it the nearest landfall?
Well...
The nearest landfall to that patch where they said it was okay for them to settle the land.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, I don't think there's any great difference between different parts of Shetland and, you know, if it depends where you're heading out from, as you say, from the west coast of Norway. It's possible that that area was more heavily settled for some particular reason, but it could just be that we're lucky in Unst that due to later agricultural and environmental fluke, these things have been better preserved. There were longhouses that were discovered along the coast of Western East Borough, but they've disappeared. I was looking at stuff that Deborah showed me, but because of where they were positioned, they've gone. Unst, they seem to be better preserved.
Probably been made into dikes.
Well, that's right. It's very rob them and you can build a dike. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But at the moment, as far as we know, Unst does have the highest concentration. But that doesn't mean that other places didn't have an equal concentration at some point in the past. It might just be something about the type of stones that they were using. Other places, they may have, as they robbed them, or they may have used more turf, because turf was also used to build houses. But Unst can be proud of that, so fact at the moment. And the Immunity Trust has done a good job in presenting the material from Unst in the book of the excavation and survey of Unst that's just come out quite recently, and that's got, you know, a great deal of information, and also the gazetteer as well, so you can go for a hike and have a look at these things. But the reports of specific longhouses, so Norwich, Belmont, Underhool and Hammer, are all very good. They're very well carried out excavations and well written up. And each one they tried to do something a little bit different. And they found different things. So if you want a really detailed view of longhouses, then that is a source. Even for people in Orkney, it's an excellent resource for longhouses. And that is the reconstructed longhouse on Unst. I'm not sure how accurate it is. I don't know about this sort of wind vane thing on the roof. But I would not have that personally. But then, who knows? But that's the part. Things to do with the roof, of course, very rarely survive, if they survive at all, on longhouses. So I suppose you can imagine anything you like when it comes to roofs. But I don't know where they got that from. Okay, so the houses that have been looked at most carefully in Unst include Norwich, which is the one that I mentioned last week, had a very early date. And I've contacted Beverly, who did the excavation there recently, and she says that she's quite happy with the dates. She thinks they came from well-established positions, that they weren't sort of older material that got mixed in with newer material, that they're actually well-established positions. So, and she's writing up more about this at the moment, which the important dates to look at are the blue ones, which are the samples from a food deposit and carbonised grain, which you can see might be from before the Viking Age, as I suggested, started in the 790s last week. They might predate that. However,
so we're looking at 650, 800.
Yes. But even dividing it in half isn't really an accurate way of working out a radiocarbon date. It's not like you can take, that's the earliest possible and that's the latest possible, therefore it must be the middle. There are statistical possibilities within that. So if you look at a radiocarbon diagram, they often have, an X and Y axis, and they do something like that. And it could be anything within there that are the most likely
It's
possibilities.
entirely plausible there was contact between Norway and Shetland before they accepted
Oh, yeah.
Viking Age. Trade, just sheer proximity,
Yes, yeah.
would indicate there would be some kind of movement.
It's entirely possible. There's no doubt about that, other than the fact that, as we saw from the boat burials, the big ships were rowing boats right up until the 780s. That's not to say they couldn't row across, but they'd have to really want to.
Yeah.
Whereas, possibly, ships with sails already existed here, because it's clear, along with Atlantic Atlantic houses, the area that is covered by Atlantic houses was an area that was in contact within a whole network of contacts, and those were by sailing ship. And they found a boat from Ireland called the Breuter boat, made of gold. It's a little boat with oars and with a mast, and it dates to about the year 0, thereabouts, maybe even 100 years before that. So there were people able to sail about. So if there was contact between Norway and Shetland in the pre-Viking period, we don't have to assume necessarily it was folks from over there coming here. It could have been the other way around. So. Anyway, yes, but it's an interesting anomaly, this, at the moment. But that's not to say that it's not true. It just needs to be, you need to find some other really early sites before we can be, before I'd be particularly happy with it. But it's exciting. So, nothing of Norwich survives, because it was excavated at the time they were expanding the graveyard, which is a bit of a shame. Great shame if they've lost the oldest known longhouse in the Northern Isles. Anyway, there we go. That's what happens. Right. So Belmont. When you come off the ferry, just head off to your right up the hill, and you'll see it. So this was excavated by Anna Christine Larsen. I've met her. She's a really nice person. She now runs the Trelleborg Viking site in Denmark, which is one of the great Viking sites to be visited anywhere in Scandinavia. And she did her PhD on Viking Age farmsteads in the North Atlantic, so she knows her way around longhouses, Viking longhouses. And she dated this, she couldn't get a really specific date, but somewhere in the 9th to 10th century. So, and she found fragments of a Norwegian-style steatite bowl, a Kleber bowl. And it's the Norwegian style seemed to be the earlier style, before they realised there were soapstone quarries in Shetland itself, so they actually imported soapstone here. The size, it's a sort of typical size, 20 metres by 7 metres. The longhouses in the Northern Isles are roughly 20 to 25 metres long. There probably are bigger ones somewhere, and perhaps ones associated with the Orkney Jarldom were substantially bigger, but so far 20 to 25 metres. And if you compare that with 80 metres for Borg, gives you some idea of the difference in scale. And they found post holes in this building. So again, it's a roof supported by posts that were inside three-aisled longhouse. And a couple of nice things turned up. There were an oil lamp, and a toy quern. I think it's a toy quern because it was, I'm sure they weren't grinding peppers or anything like that. It's a small thing. So get the children used to what they're going to have to do when they grow up. Steatite as well. Upper Underhool, just up the hill from the site that Small excavated, has some very interesting construction features. The wall facing the slope seems to have been made with turf, and turf is very common use. It was used very commonly, for example, in Iceland for longhouses. And of course, if you build a house of turf, you're unlikely to to find much evidence of it, unless, in this case, there was another bit, the stone bit that was there. So there will have been a lot of stone, of turf-built houses in the Northern Isles that have disappeared from view. And the other thing that this had, it seems to have a sprung floor, which is interesting as well. So, which is part of, if you think of the wooden construction, it's quite easy to stick a wooden floor into the thing. So. I have to go into some Orkney ones, I think, now. But first of all, we'll just finish with Hamar. It was considered to be a very typical and possibly very old longhouse, beautifully excavated, but not a lot of stuff turned up in it.
Is Hamar in North Maiden?
No, this is Hamar in Unst as well. In Unst, yes, is the other Unst one. It looks over to Isle of Balta. Unfortunately, it had been scalped at some point in the past, and that's the turf and all the earth had been wheaked out, taken away, and used in somebody's land. So a lot of nice dating evidence had disappeared. But the reason for that, I think, Hamar is particularly interesting, is the little shape that you see here under the dividing wall in this longhouse. And that is, there's evidence of a pit house underlying the longhouse. And I haven't mentioned pit houses, but they turn up in their thousands in Denmark, and they turn up in Norway. They're just small houses that they've dug into the earth, and then presumably they put a wall around it. But there was no wall surviving in the pit house here at Hamar, presumably because it had been used. But it had left a hole in the ground, which you can see here under the stone. And that gave a date. So that was dated, because of the hearth, to about the 11th century. So the longhouse is actually later than that, because this lies underneath the longhouse. So it's not an early Viking longhouse, this one. It's a later Norse house. But the pit house is an interesting construction. This is one from Norway. And it was small. So it was like, 5 by 3 metres, thereabouts. Had a fireplace at one end, and it's difficult to know exactly what they were used for. There are different ideas. There's some reconstructed ones from Avaldsnes in Norway. They may have been lived in, or they may have been for some particular purpose. It's been suggested one purpose might have been for the making of nets, because a lot of them in Denmark, it's been suggested they were damp, and the dampness might have helped for the manipulation of wool. So it might have been there that they made their, not nets, sails for their ships. But I don't think that's necessarily the case in Hamar. It's just an oddity. But it's good to have at least one pit house in Shetland, and it's the only one. I haven't found one in Orkney yet. Which brings me to Orkney. Orkney has some outstanding Norse period structures too. An early one, early in the sense of being excavated quite early, is Bucquoy. And this was excavated in 1970-71 by Anna Ritchie. And it threw up some intriguing anomalies, one of which was the continuity of apparently pre-Viking pots and pins into the Norse period, which caused a lot of confusion and fury. And she was accused that it might be residual stuff, like they might have moved a midden into their house to make an earth floor or something of that sort. There were Norse houses built on top of Pictish houses, and there were 5 major structural periods dating from some point in the pre-Viking period up until the 10th century, and the last, the Viking house, was dated by a burial of a male in a simple grave being buried into the floor of the Viking house, which sort of dated it because he had a penny of Edmund, an English king, from 940 to 946. So he was buried then or a bit later. So the house had ceased to be a house before that. So whatever you want to say, 900 or something like that.
Is that a site near the sea? Where is Buckwhy? And I don't know the name.
Yeah, it's near the sea. There's a cliff edge.
Oh, that's
What part of Orkney is that?
Uh,
It's on the mainland.
yeah, where's remind me again where Buckwhy is.
Topquay or Buckwhy?
Sorry,
Topquay.
Buckwhy. Yeah,
It's in Westbury.
it's in Westbury. Ah, yes, yes. Forgotten about that. Yeah.
That's been lost at the sea.
Yeah. So we've got several, well, two Norse remnants of Norse longhouses there, but what's particularly interesting about Buckwhy is the structure that lies underneath, directly underneath the Norse
Hello,
house.
can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Hi, it's Susan.
Hello,
Finally.
Susan. You are with us.
Hello. Buckwhy is next to the Brough of Bursay.
Ah, yes, it's that one. Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm glad you're with us. That's good. I was wondering if you were able to be with us.
Yeah, sorry, I've been trying to talk to you for a while, but I've just, I think it's working now, hopefully.
It certainly is. Oh, good stuff.
Okay.
Thank you. So there we are. It's been explained. I couldn't remember. Okay, but this odd structure that is called, House 4 here on Anna Ritchie's plan is an intriguing thing. This is the latest of the structures underlying the longhouses. I know we're talking about longhouses, but we have to mention this. And it was abandoned, according to her report, for some time before the first longhouse was built. And it's a sub-rectangular structure. There's a sub-rectangular room, and then another odd room on the end, and a room on this end. So from the outside, it would have looked rectangular, reasonably rectangular, anyway. And it has a central hearth. A small one, but it has a central hearth, and it seems to have benches on the other side as well. So, in some ways, it's reminiscent of a longhouse, or some aspects of a longhouse, which is intriguing. And, well, I suppose you can draw your own conclusions. Either it's perhaps cultural influence coming in the pre-Norse period, or I sometimes wonder if it's a Pictish attempt at a longhouse, an early date. But I'll leave that one hanging. It's definitely an odd structure, anyway. A blending of two building traditions. Probably not, but let's leave it there. Okay. David Griffiths of Oxford University has recently excavated the site at scale. And that's a superb site. It's available online, the material, so I recommend you have a look at that. And what you've got here is a reconstruction of the building. And you'll note that this reconstruction suggests that the roof bearing timbers are actually laid on the walls in this case. And
What date is this, Andrew, did you say?
Well, I'm not entirely sure, but maybe Susan knows. In southern Scandinavia, the use of the walls to start bearing the weight seems to have started to come in the early 10th and into the 11th century. But not in every case, but you do actually you do see it's coming in. And it gradually eliminated the interior rows of roof supporting posts. So, early 10th, maybe 11th, into the 10th century, I would imagine, at scale. And the place name scale is interesting. I'll just come back to that just in a second, because I'd like to just show you there's the excavation picture of the longhouse at scale. And the other site, which, if you do want to treat yourself to a Christmas present, next Christmas. The excavations at Pool of Sandy is a tremendous book, because Pool at Sandy is an extraordinary site. It was excavated by John Hunter in the 80s and has just been published, 2007. And it seems to be in a Neolithic site originally. Then there was a gap, and it was built on in the later Iron Age and in the Norse period. Something I haven't dealt with, but it's been suggested that the Norse also like to build their longhouses, certainly in Orkney, on mounds and farm mounds that already existed. Partly because it was handy, you had your stone around you, but also it made a statement that you were on a sort of a prominent position that your house could be seen. And farm mounds are certainly a feature of the west coast of Norway as well. So it's perhaps not unsurprising that they chose to build their houses on pre-existing house mounds. We don't have a lot of time to look at that, unfortunately, but so I would suggest either getting the report or going online and seeing what you can find. The interesting thing that I think about Pool at Sandy, is that there is evidence of something which is perhaps the exception that proves the rule about rectangular buildings, because there's evidence of a large rectangular or sub-rectangular building from the Pictish period at Pool, and that's a picture of it there. It's just to show the complexity of these things. This was 14 metres by 3 metres, so it's a reasonably sized structure, and it had an Ogham inscription and a little Pictish symbol in it, just to prove that in fact it was a Pictish site. It dates between 210 and 660, so there's a really wide date, but perhaps we're talking about the 5th or 6th century for the structure 23 being built. John Hunter found something which is interesting. He thought that it looked as if the settlement was on its uppers before the Viking Age actually started. That the settlement had contracted, and that there was a decline in population. They'd sort of filled in a lot of their fancy buildings at Pool before the Norse built their buildings on it. And the other thing that we'll carry on, I think, next week. We'll finish off this, so I won't rush ahead. What he suggested he'd found in phase 7 of the site was that he thought he'd found an interface between pre-Viking and the Viking period, a bit like what Anna Ritchie had found at Bucquoy. He found the building towards the north of the site of a Norse longhouse, 16 metres by 5 metres, so that's not a terribly big one. But he also found material culture which he considered demonstrably Pictish continuing into this period, this phase. He found the survival of fragments of 600 different Pictish pottery vessels, and even the suggestion that the pottery styles had developed slightly during at this point, and Pictish pins and combs continued to be used. So you've got the evidence of a Norse house, and all that represents, as we've been talking about, but the continuity of pots and pins of Pictish style being used. Now, people will argue about that, whether that's residual. He says it isn't residual; that in fact he's found it in good evidence for this is the fact continuing. But then there's a break, and there's another house built on at a later date in the 10th or 11th century, which has just purely Norse cultural material in it. So as if there's a period of some sort of mixing, and then there's a new Norse house built, and the mixing ceases. So you can make of that as you will. It's unlikely that it's Picts building Norse houses. As we've said, houses are invested with such symbolic power. But it might be Norse making use of an existing Pictish population to make them pots and pins before that aspect of society goes, a new house is built on top. It was during the later 10th century that the site was levelled and a new house, longhouse, was built on top. So that's us run out of time. I'm sorry the pictures didn't work, but I'll put that online, and I'll give you the Dropbox contact, and we'll just finish off next week by having a little look at the houses from other parts of the North Atlantic, a little mention of halls, since that was discussed, and then I'd like to look at the scale hoard next week, and look at the artistic connections that embodies and the cultural connections. So we'll do that. But then I'll say, everybody, I'm sorry that you weren't able to see that. I apologise for that, and we'll see you sometime.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay, good night. Good night, Susan.
Is it likely there was other Jarlshofs spread through Shetland, a kind of gathering place, a market meeting place throughout Shetland? Was Jarlshof the only place? Would there have been other Jarlshof? Maybe in the site of Scalava, I suppose, in places like Vaughan, I suppose.
So I'm sure there were other large farming communities with more than one house. Yeah.
Yeah. Because, I mean, it was the Vikings that established the Thames.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have your parish names ending in Thames, they were obviously spread all over the place.
Mm.
It might have been a little time before they did that, but I mean, Jarlshof is distinct, isn't it?
It is distinct,
But
but
maybe there are other types of...
But that's just because we haven't found any others like that yet.
Yeah, I don't suppose Jarlshof would have been found so easily, but it hadn't been that massive storm
No. No.
in the 1880s.